The dreams about Vietnam were finally starting to fade when I decided to buy that Airstream trailer. Something about its shiny silver body and the promise of the open road called to me. After 15 years of trying to forget the war, I figured maybe what I needed was to just drive until the memories couldn't catch up anymore. My therapist thought it was a good idea too. "Get some fresh air, James," she'd said. "The Grand Canyon is beautiful this time of year." What she didn't know was that I wasn't heading for the tourist spots. No, I'd found a map of the lesser-known routes, the ones that wound through a place the locals called Devil's Canyon. It was perfect, quiet, remote, and far from the crowds of people who always seemed to be watching me like they knew what I'd done. The first few days were exactly what I needed. Just me, my new Airstream, and miles of red rock stretching out in every direction. During the day, I'd sit outside with my coffee, watching hawks circle overhead. At night, I'd listen to the coyotes howl at the moon. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Then I found those stones poking out of the dirt. They weren't just random rocks, they were arranged too perfectly for that. When I brushed away some of the dust, I saw the old carvings. My hands started shaking before my brain even made the connection. I'd seen burial grounds before, halfway across the world in another life. But this time was different. This time, something in the air changed the moment my fingers touched those stones. That evening, when the sun started sinking behind the canyon walls, I noticed the first shadow. It wasn't like a regular shadow. It moved when nothing was there to cast it. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I saw another one, taller this time, sliding across the rocks near my campfire. My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I made my way back to the Airstream. Inside, I locked the door and pulled all the curtains shut. "You're just tired," I whispered to myself. "It's nothing but the wind and the rocks." But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen enough in Vietnam to know when something wasn't right. The next morning, I drove into the nearest town for supplies. That's where I met Joe, an old Native American man who ran the general store. As he rang up my items, I casually mentioned where I was camping. The way his face changed made my stomach drop. "Devil's Canyon," he said, his voice getting quiet. "We don't go there anymore. Not since the massacre." He told me how, 100 years ago, soldiers had cornered a group of Native Americans in that canyon. They'd killed everyone, men, women, children. The bodies were buried right where they fell. "The spirits there," Joe said, looking straight into my eyes, "they don't forget, and they don't forgive." I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was just trying to scare a tourist, but all I could think about were those shadows I'd seen, and how they seemed to be wearing feathers in their hair. When I tried driving back to my campsite, something strange happened. No matter which turn I took, I somehow ended up back at those burial stones. It was like the canyon itself was playing with me, leading me in circles until I ended up exactly where the spirits wanted me. That night, the memories I'd been running from finally caught up with me. As I sat in my Airstream, listening to the wind howl outside, my mind went back to that village in Vietnam. We'd been told there were enemy soldiers hiding there. What we found instead was an ancient burial site, sacred to the local people. But we had our orders, and I watched as my unit destroyed everything. The shadows outside my trailer were getting closer now. I could see their shapes through the curtains, tall figures with feathers in their hair and weapons in their hands. They moved like smoke, drifting through the darkness, but there was nothing smoky about the way they banged on my trailer's walls. I tried starting the engine again, but it just made a sick clicking sound. The radio crackled to life on its own, playing nothing but static. Through the noise, I could hear something else, chanting, soft and low, in a language I didn't understand. Then I heard another voice, one that made my blood run cold. It was coming from right outside my door. "We know what you did." The voice wasn't angry. It was calm, which somehow made it worse. "The land remembers. Our brothers and sisters in the far land told us about you." My hand started shaking so bad I dropped my flashlight. The spirits from Vietnam, they hadn't just followed me home. They'd told the spirits here about what we'd done to their sacred places. All these years I thought I was running from memories, but I was really running from them. The banging got louder, and now my trailer was rocking back and forth like it was caught in a storm. But when I looked outside, the night was perfectly still, not even a breeze. Just those shadows, getting closer and closer, surrounding me on all sides. I knew I couldn't hide in the trailer forever. With shaking hands, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cold night air. The shadows were everywhere now, some tall, some short, some looking like warriors, others like women and children. They formed a circle around me, their eyes glowing like dying embers. One of them stepped forward. He was taller than the others, with feathers that seemed to float in the still air. "You carry a weight," he said, his voice somehow inside my head. The weight of disrespect, the weight of destruction. Behind him, I saw other shapes forming, different spirits wearing the clothes of Vietnamese villagers. They were the ones from that sacred place we'd destroyed, joining hands with the Native American spirits. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees in the dirt. "Please," I whispered, tears running down my face. I was just following orders. I didn't know. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I had known it was wrong. I'd felt it in my bones when we did it, but I'd stayed quiet, followed along. The tall spirit raised his hand, and suddenly I couldn't move. The air around me got thick, like I was sinking in invisible quicksand. The spirits started moving in closer, their forms becoming more solid with each step. I could see their faces now, not angry, but sad, so terribly sad. "Your guilt has called us," the tall spirit said. "Now you must face what you have done, not just to us, but to all sacred places, to all who came before." The spirits started a slow dance around me, their shapes blending together like smoke. Each time they passed, I felt memories wash over me. The sacred grounds in Vietnam, the cries of the villagers, the silence of my unit as we destroyed everything. Now here I was, years later, face to face with the same kind of desecration. "You cannot run anymore," the tall spirit said. "But you can make things right." Suddenly, I understood what I had to do. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and called Joe from the general store. Even though it was the middle of the night, he answered right away, like he'd been waiting for my call. "I need to report a finding," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There are burial grounds here that need protection." As I spoke the words, I felt something lift from my shoulders, a weight I'd been carrying since Vietnam. The spirits moved closer, but they weren't threatening anymore. The tall one touched my shoulder, and in that moment, I saw visions of both burial grounds being preserved, protected, honored as they should be. I saw myself helping to make it happen, working with Joe and his people to keep these sacred places safe. When the sun rose the next morning, I was still sitting in the dirt. The spirits were gone, but I knew they weren't far. They would be watching, waiting to see if I kept my promise. My Airstream started on the first try now, but I didn't leave Devil's Canyon. Instead, I drove to Joe's store to begin making things right. Some nights I still see shadows moving in the corner of my eye, but they don't scare me anymore. They remind me of my promise, not just to protect this place, but to finally face what I did in Vietnam. Sometimes the only way to stop running from your past is to turn around and make peace with it. The singing started on our first night at Moonlight Bay. It floated through the windows of Tom's old RV, gentle like a lullaby, but somehow wrong. My 3 kids, Danny, Sarah, and little Michael, slept soundly in their bunks, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Coming here was probably a mistake. Everything reminded me of Tom. The way the RV's door stuck just like it always had. The little seashell wind chimes he'd hung from the rearview mirror. Even the worn spot on the driver's seat where he used to rest his arm. 6 months since the fishing accident took him from us, and the pain still felt fresh. But the kids needed this trip. They'd been cooped up in our Portland house, drowning in grief just like me. Danny, my oldest at 12, tried so hard to be the man of the house. 10-year-old Sarah barely smiled anymore. And Michael, only 6, kept asking when Daddy was coming home. The ocean waves crashed against the shore outside, a sound that used to bring me peace. Tom and I had spent our honeymoon camping along this same stretch of coast. Now, something about the water made my skin crawl. Maybe it was that strange singing, rising and falling with the tide. Or maybe it was the way the moonlight seemed to dance on the waves, like pale fingers beckoning us toward the sea. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and told myself I was being silly. We were safe here. The campground had other families, and the old lighthouse stood guard nearby, its beam sweeping across the water every few seconds. Tomorrow would be better. We'd build sand castles, hunt for agates, and maybe start healing. If only I'd known then what that singing really meant. If only I'd packed up my babies and driven far away from Moonlight Bay that very night. The next morning, Danny woke up excited. "Mom, did you hear the music last night? It was so pretty." He was already pulling on his shoes, eager to get to the beach. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright for the first time in months. "It sounded like people singing in the water. Can we go look?" Something in my stomach tightened, but I pushed the feeling away. They were finally showing interest in something. How could I say no? After a quick breakfast of cereal in paper bowls, we headed down to the beach. The day was perfect for beachcombing. The tide had pulled way out, leaving tide pools full of starfish and tiny crabs. Michael squealed with delight at every shell he found, stuffing his pockets until they bulged. Even I started to relax, watching my children play in the morning sun. But as the afternoon wore on, things began to feel different. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, even though the weather report had promised clear skies. Danny kept wandering closer to the water's edge, staring out at the waves like he was looking for something. "What do you see out there?" I asked him, trying to keep my voice casual. "I think," he squinted into the mist, "I think I see people swimming, way out there, and they're still singing, Mom. Can't you hear it?" I couldn't hear anything except the waves, but the way Danny said it made my arms break out in goosebumps. I called everyone back to the RV early, promising hot chocolate and a movie. Sarah and Michael came running, but Danny lingered, his feet dragging in the sand. That night, the singing was louder. It wove through my dreams, sweet voices calling out names I almost recognized. I woke up twice to find Danny sitting by the window, pressing his face against the glass like he was trying to see through the darkness. "Go to bed, honey," I told him the second time, leading him back to his bunk. But as I tucked him in, he grabbed my hand. "They want us to come play with them, Mom," he whispered. "They say the water's warm and full of treasures." I locked the RV door that night and pulled all the curtains shut, but somehow the singing still found its way in. I jolted awake at 3 a.m. The RV door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. Danny's bunk was empty. "Danny?" My voice shook as I called his name. The singing outside had grown so loud it seemed to fill my head. Sarah and Michael were still asleep, but Danny's shoes were gone, and his blanket lay crumpled on the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, my bare feet sinking into the cold sand. The fog was so thick I could barely see the beam of the lighthouse cutting through it. "Danny!" I screamed his name over and over, running up and down the beach. The water looked different in the darkness, almost like it was glowing from underneath. And there, at the edge of the waves, I found his shoes, both of them placed neatly side by side, like he'd stepped right out of them. I called the police, of course. They came with their bright lights and search boats. They told me kids sometimes sleepwalk, that he couldn't have gone far. But none of them mentioned the singing, even though it was still echoing across the water. When I tried to tell them about it, they just gave me those looks, the same ones I got after Tom died, full of pity and doubt. For 3 days they searched. I barely slept, barely ate. Sarah and Michael stayed close to me, their eyes big and scared. But deep down I knew the moment I saw those empty shoes by the water. Danny was gone, just like Tom, taken by whatever lived in those dark waves. On the 4th morning, something washed up on the shore. It was Danny's favorite baseball cap, the one Tom had given him for his last birthday. But the strange thing was, it wasn't wet. It sat on the sand like it had been carefully placed there, bone dry despite the morning dew that covered everything else. And written in the sand next to it in perfect flowing letters, "He's happy here." That's when I knew I had to talk to the old lighthouse keeper. Because the night before, while I was sitting on the beach crying, I'd seen him watching our campsite. He knew something. I could tell by the way he shook his head and turned away when the police asked him questions. I just didn't know then that learning the truth would cost me even more than I'd already lost. The lighthouse keeper's name was Joe Miller, and he'd worked at Moonlight Bay for over 40 years. His little house sat right at the base of the lighthouse, with windows that looked out over the whole beach. I left Sarah and Michael with a kind family in the nearby campsite and walked up the winding path to his door. "I've been waiting for you," he said when he opened the door. His face was weathered like old driftwood, and his eyes were full of sadness. "Come in, Mrs. Thompson. We need to talk about your boy." My heart stopped. "You know something about Danny?" He led me into his kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee with shaking hands. Old newspapers covered his walls, dozens of them, yellowed with age. As I looked closer, I saw the headlines. "Child missing at Moonlight Bay, 1938. 3 children vanish without trace, 1968. Local family, devastated by mysterious disappearance, 1998. It happens every 30 years, Joe said quietly. "Always in the summer, always children. The singing starts, and then..." He trailed off, staring out at the ocean. "What takes them?" I whispered, though part of me didn't want to know. "We call them the people of the deep. They look almost human until you see their eyes." He picked up an old photo from the table and handed it to me. It showed a strange shape in the water, barely visible in the moonlight. But I could make out a face, beautiful and terrible at the same time, with eyes that glowed like pale moons. "They're lonely," he said. "They need children to keep their colony alive. And they..." He stopped, his voice breaking. "They take the parents too, sometimes. Anyone who knows too much." That's when I remembered something, how Tom had been acting strange before his fishing trip, how he'd been reading old books about local legends, how he'd made me promise to never take the kids to Moonlight Bay. "Your husband found out," Joe said softly. "He tried to warn people, and he didn't need to finish. I knew now why they'd never found Tom's body." I stood up so fast my chair fell over. "Sarah and Michael. I have to get them out of here." But when I reached the window, my blood turned to ice. The fog was rolling in again, thick and unnatural, and through it I could hear the singing, louder than ever before. "They won't let you leave now," Joe said behind me. "Not when you know the truth." I ran down the lighthouse path so fast I nearly fell. The fog was getting thicker by the second, swallowing everything in its path. I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. The singing grew louder with each step, and now I could make out words, sweet, gentle words promising happiness and treasures beneath the waves. When I reached the campsite where I'd left my children, the kind family's RV was empty. On their table, a note written in dripping letters. "They're playing with us now. Sarah, Michael." My screams echoed across the empty beach. Then I heard Michael's laugh coming from the water's edge. Through the fog I saw them, Sarah and Michael holding hands, walking slowly toward the waves. Their eyes looked glazed, like they were in a dream. And in the water, just beyond where the waves broke, pale faces were rising to the surface. Beautiful faces with moonlight eyes, reaching out with long white fingers. "Stop!" I ran toward them, but my feet kept sinking in the wet sand. "Sarah, Michael, come back." Sarah turned to look at me, but her face wasn't scared anymore. She was smiling that same peaceful smile Danny had worn before he disappeared. "Mom, they're showing us where Danny is. And Dad, too. They're both waiting for us." The singing grew so loud it hurt my ears. One of the creatures, I couldn't call them merfolk anymore, they were too terrible for that fairy tale name, lifted its head fully from the water. Its face looked just like mine. "Join us," it said in my own voice. "Your family is here. No more pain, no more grief. Michael was already ankle-deep in the water. Sarah was right behind him. And I knew with a horrible certainty that I had only seconds to save them. That's when I remembered what Joe had said. They need children to keep their colony alive, and I understood what I had to do. Wait! I splashed into the water after them. Take me instead. The singing stopped. Every pale face in the water turned to look at me. Take me, I said again, my voice shaking. I'm stronger than the children. I'll serve your colony better. Just let them go. The creature with my face tilted its head, considering. The water around me was starting to glow with a strange blue light. For a long moment, only the sound of waves filled the air. Then the creature spoke again, this time in Tom's voice. A mother's sacrifice. Yes, this will serve us well. Sarah and Michael started blinking, like they were waking up from a deep sleep. The strange look left their eyes. Run, I told them, as the cold water crept up to my waist. Run to Joe at the lighthouse. Don't look back. Mommy? Michael's voice was small and scared. Go! I screamed, and finally they turned and ran. I watched their small figures disappear into the fog, making sure they were really gone. The water was up to my chest now, but I wasn't scared anymore. I'd done what any mother would do. Then I felt them, cold hands wrapping around my legs, gentle but strong. The creature with my face smiled, showing teeth that gleamed like pearls. Your husband fought us, it whispered. But you understand, don't you? The deep calls to the deep. And now you'll be with him again. As they pulled me under, I caught one last glimpse of the lighthouse beam cutting through the fog. A light in the darkness, watching over my children who would live. They say if you go to Moonlight Bay now, you can sometimes hear singing on summer nights. Beautiful voices calling from the waves, a mother's voice among them. But the local families know better than to let their children wander near the water after dark. And up in the lighthouse, Joe keeps watch. He's added one more newspaper to his wall. Brave mother missing, children saved at Moonlight Bay. Next to it, he's pinned a note written in Sarah's childish handwriting. We remember. Sarah and Michael grew up safe with their aunt in Portland. They never returned to the coast, but they tell their own children to listen to their hearts, just like their mother did. To love deeply, fiercely, and without fear, because sometimes love is stronger than any darkness, even the darkness that lives in the deepest parts of the sea. And on very quiet nights, when the moon is full and the tide is high, the lighthouse keeper swears he can see two figures walking along the shoreline, a man and a woman hand in hand, keeping watch over the bay where their story began. The sun was setting as I drove my truck down Route 66, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My truck's headlights cut through the growing darkness, and the radio played old country songs to keep me company. It had been a long day of driving, and I still had miles to go before reaching my next stop. That's when I saw her standing by the road outside Albuquerque, a young woman in a blue polka dot dress that looked like something from my mom's old photos. She had her thumb out, looking small and lost against the vast desert backdrop. Now, I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about her made me stop. Maybe it was the way she hugged herself against the cold, or how she reminded me of my little sister. Need a ride? I called out, rolling down my window. She smiled, such a sweet, sad smile, and introduced herself as Lucy. The moment she climbed into my truck, the temperature dropped so much I could see my breath. I blamed it on my faulty air conditioning, but deep down, something felt off. The radio started crackling with static, and through the noise, I heard bits and pieces of an old news report about missing persons along Route 66. Lucy sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Under the dashboard lights, I noticed her dress wasn't just old-fashioned, it was worn and faded, like it had been buried in someone's attic for decades. When she finally spoke, she talked about things that made no sense to me, about how excited she was to see the new Chevrolet Bel Air at the dealership, and how she hoped to catch the latest Dean Martin movie at the drive-in. I nodded along, but my skin was starting to crawl. Every town we passed through, something strange happened. The radio would crackle louder, and in my rearview mirror, I started seeing things that couldn't be there. More passengers, appearing one by one, all dressed like they stepped out of the 1950s. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when Lucy turned to me and said something that made my blood run cold. "You look just like your father, Robert. He used to drive this route too, didn't he?" My hands started shaking on the wheel. How did she know my father's name? How did she know about his old trucking route? I wanted to pull over and ask her to get out, but when I looked in my mirror again, I saw them more clearly now. 3 more passengers sitting quietly in the back of my truck. There was a teenage boy in a Letterman jacket, an older woman in a flowery dress, and a man in overalls. They hadn't been there minutes ago, but somehow they were here now. The boy looked up and caught my eye in the mirror. "Your father was there the night I disappeared," the boy said softly. "October 15th, 1952. I was walking home from football practice when a black car pulled up beside me. The woman in the flowery dress leaned forward. Me too, March 1953. I was closing up my diner when 2 men came in. One of them looked just like you, Robert. He said he needed help with his car." My mouth went dry. The stories kept coming, one after another. Each ghost, because that's what they had to be, had met my father before they vanished. But they all mentioned another man too, someone they called the driver. Lucy touched my arm, and her hand felt like ice. "The driver is still out there, Robert. He's old now, but he's still hunting. We've been watching him for years, waiting for someone who could help us. When we saw you on this road, looking so much like your father." I pulled into a truck stop, needing a minute to think. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but they seemed to pass right through my passengers. Other truckers walked by, not even glancing at my truck full of people who weren't really there. "My father," I whispered. "He helped this killer, the driver?" "He was scared," Lucy explained. "The driver had pictures of your family. He threatened to hurt you and your mother if your father didn't help him. But your father kept a secret diary, Robert. He wrote down everything. Names, dates, places. We need your help to find it." The radio crackled again, and through the static, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a current news report about another disappearance, just last week. Same method, same story. Someone offering to help with a broken-down car. The driver was still out there. And somehow, these ghosts thought I was the key to stopping him. My ghostly passengers helped me piece together the clues from their stories. Dad had always kept his important papers in our old family barn outside Flagstaff. If his diary was anywhere, it would be there. The ghosts grew quieter as we got closer, like they were holding their breath, even though they didn't need to breathe anymore. The barn looked smaller than I remembered, its wood gray and weathered under the moonlight. My hands trembled as I pulled out my flashlight and pushed open the creaky door. Lucy and the others stayed close, their shapes glowing faintly in the darkness. Up there, the boy in the Letterman jacket pointed to the rafters, behind the loose board. I climbed the old ladder slowly, trying not to think about how high up I was. The board came loose easily, and behind it was a dusty metal box. Inside, I found what we were looking for: Dad's diary, filled with shaky handwriting and newspaper clippings. But there was something else: recent newspaper clippings about missing people, and a familiar address circled in red pen. My blood ran cold when I realized it was the driver keeping track of Dad's old hideout. Just then, headlights swept across the barn windows. An old black car pulled up outside. "He's here," Lucy whispered, her voice shaking. "The driver still comes here sometimes, looking for your father." I heard the car door slam and slow, shuffling footsteps. The ghosts gathered around me, their cold presence somehow making me feel braver. Through the barn's dusty window, I saw him, an old man with white hair, walking with a cane, but his eyes were sharp and cruel in the moonlight. The driver looked up directly at the window where I stood. A cold smile spread across his face as he reached into his jacket pocket. All these years, and he was still hunting, still hurting people, But this time, he wasn't alone with his victim. This time his past had caught up with him, and I had proof of every horrible thing he'd done, written in my father's own hand. I pulled out my phone, already dialing the police. The ghosts stood with me, their stories finally ready to be told. The next few hours felt like a dream. Police cars surrounded the barn, their red and blue lights flashing in the dark. The driver, whose real name turned out to be Frank Miller, didn't even try to run. Maybe he was too old, or maybe he was just tired of running. The diary changed everything. Dad had written down every detail, dates, places, and names of all the people Miller had hurt. He'd been too scared to turn it in while he was alive, afraid of what Miller might do to our family. But he'd left the truth for someone to find. One by one, my ghostly passengers began to fade. Lucy was the last to go. "Thank you, Robert," she said softly. "Your father made mistakes, but you made them right." Then she was gone, leaving nothing but a gentle cold spot in the air where she'd stood. The police found evidence in Miller's house that solved dozens of missing person cases. Some families finally learned what had happened to their loved ones after 20 years of wondering. Dad's diary helped them find places where Miller had hidden his victims, giving many families a chance to properly say goodbye. I still drive Route 66. Sometimes, when the sun is setting and the radio starts to static, I think I catch glimpses of them in my mirror, Lucy and the others. They're not trapped anymore, but I think they still watch over this road, making sure nothing like that ever happens again. And me? I learned that sometimes the scariest ghosts aren't the ones that haunt old roads or barns. They're the secrets we keep, the truths we're afraid to face. My father died carrying the weight of his secrets, but in the end, he left a way to make things right. Now when I pick up late-night passengers, I tell them this story, not to scare them, but to remind them that it's never too late to tell the truth, even if you need a little help from the other side to do it. The sun was setting as our RV chugged along the empty Nevada desert road. Mom kept saying we should have taken the main highway, but Dad insisted this shortcut would save us 2 hours on our way to California. My little sister Sarah was asleep in the back, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, while I sat at the small dining table reading my comic books. "Something doesn't sound right," Mom said, leaning forward in her seat. The RV had started making weird clicking noises about 10 minutes ago, and now black smoke was coming from under the hood. Dad tried to keep driving, but the engine made one final loud bang before going completely silent. We rolled to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Miles of empty desert stretched out around us, except for what looked like old buildings in the distance. Through the dusty windshield, I could make out wooden structures that reminded me of the ghost towns we'd seen in movies. "Look, there's a town right there," Dad said, pointing. "I'll walk over and see if anyone's around who can help. Maybe they have a phone we can use." He grabbed his red baseball cap and water bottle, giving Mom a quick kiss. "I'll be back before it gets dark." Mom didn't want him to go. "William, we should stay together. This place gives me the creeps." She was right. Something about those old buildings made my stomach feel funny. "Helen, we can't just sit here all night," Dad said with that tone he uses when his mind is made up. "Keep the doors locked. I'll be quick." As Dad walked away, the desert wind picked up, making the old RV creak. Sarah woke up and started asking where Daddy was going. I tried distracting her by sharing my comics, but she kept looking out the window, watching Dad get smaller and smaller until he was just a tiny dot heading toward the town. Mom decided to look through the RV's manual, hoping to figure out what went wrong with the engine. That's when she found something in the glove compartment that made her face go white. A stack of old Polaroid photographs, yellow and curled at the edges. My heart nearly stopped when I saw what they showed. In one of the photos, dated 1953, there was an RV that looked exactly like ours, parked in the exact same spot where we had broken down. Another photo showed a family standing next to it, smiling at the camera. But the last photo was different. It showed the same family, but they weren't smiling anymore. They were running from something, their faces twisted in terror. The sun had almost disappeared now, painting the desert in deep red. Dad should have been back already. As darkness crept in around us, we heard something that made us all freeze, a sound coming from somewhere in that old ghost town. It wasn't Dad's voice calling for us. It was singing, old mining songs, carried to us on the wind, sung by many voices that shouldn't have been there at all. Mom kept checking her watch and pacing inside the RV. It had been 2 hours since Dad left, and the desert had turned pitch black. Sarah was crying softly, and I tried to be brave for her, but my hands were shaking too. "We have to look for him," Mom finally said, grabbing the flashlight from our emergency kit. "Tommy, you stay here with Sarah. Lock the doors, and don't open them for anyone except me or Dad." She gave us both tight hugs, and I could feel her heart racing. "Mom, please don't go," Sarah begged, holding on to Mom's jacket. But we all knew someone had to find Dad. After Mom left, I sat with Sarah in the back of the RV, both of us wrapped in blankets. The desert gets really cold at night, and our heater wouldn't work without the engine running. The wind outside made weird whistling sounds as it passed through the old town's buildings. That's when we heard the first scream. It wasn't like the screams in movies or TV shows. This one sounded real, far away but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Was that Mommy?" she whispered. "No," I lied, trying to sound sure. "It was probably just the wind." But we both knew wind doesn't sound like that. I looked out the window, trying to spot Mom's flashlight beam in the darkness. Instead, I saw several small lights moving around in the ghost town, like people carrying lanterns. They were moving in a weird pattern, almost like they were searching for something. Or someone. Then Mom's light appeared, moving fast toward the RV. She was running. When she reached us, she was out of breath and shaking. I unlocked the door, and she practically fell inside. "We have to get out of here," she gasped, locking the door behind her. "Now." "But what about Dad?" I asked. Mom's hands trembled as she showed us what she'd found. Dad's red baseball cap, covered in dirt, and something else that looked dark and sticky. But that wasn't the worst part. She'd also found more photos, hidden in one of the old buildings. They showed dozens of families, all broken down in the same spot as us, all throughout different years. And in every photo, the families looked terrified. "There are people living under the town," Mom whispered, her voice shaking. "In the old mine shafts. I saw them. They're not right. And they have Dad." The singing started again, closer this time. Through the RV's windows, we could see shadows moving toward us in the darkness. Lots of shadows. And they were carrying things that looked like tools, mining tools. Mom jumped into the driver's seat and tried to start the engine again and again, but it just made that awful clicking sound. The shadows kept getting closer. We could hear them talking now, in voices that sounded rusty from being underground too long. They were talking about how hungry they were. And then we heard another voice that made Sarah start crying again. It was Dad's voice, but it sounded wrong, like he was singing along with them. The people from the mine surrounded our RV. In the moonlight, I could see their faces, pale and dirty, with eyes that weren't used to normal light. They wore old, torn clothes that looked like they belonged in a history book. Some of them had pickaxes and rusty shovels. "Helen," one of them called out in a scratchy voice. "Helen, bring the children out. William wants to see them." Mom pulled us away from the windows and into the RV's tiny bathroom. She spoke in a whisper. "There's a small window here. Tommy, you go first, then help Sarah through. I'll be right behind you." My hands were shaking so bad I could barely open the window. It was tight, but I managed to squeeze through. When my feet hit the ground, I saw we were on the darker side of the RV, away from the mine people. I reached back up to help Sarah, trying to keep her quiet as she cried. That's when we saw Dad walking through the crowd. But he wasn't tied up or hurt like I expected. He was walking with them, talking and laughing. His eyes looked different, empty somehow, like he'd forgotten who he was. "William, please." Mom begged through the window. "These are your children." Dad's voice came back weird and hollow. "They'll be part of the family now, Helen, the real family. Down in the mines, we take care of each other. We survive together." He smiled, but it wasn't Dad's smile anymore. "There's no food up here anymore. Hasn't been for years. But we found a way to live. The old miners showed us how." I understood then what he meant by food, and I felt sick to my stomach. Sarah must have understood too, because she started shaking. Mom finally squeezed through the window. The mine people were trying to break into the RV, not knowing we'd escaped. We had maybe a minute before they'd check around back. "Run to the road," Mom whispered, picking up Sarah. "Don't look back, just run." We ran across the desert, stumbling in the dark. I could hear them shouting when they discovered the empty RV. Flashlight beams started sweeping the desert behind us. "They're heading for the road," I heard Dad yell. His voice echoed off the hills, not sounding anything like my father anymore. "Cut them off at the old tunnel." Mom grabbed my hand and pulled us toward a different direction. "There's another way," she said. "I saw it in one of the photos, an old ranger station, about a mile through those rocks. We just have to." She stopped talking when we heard engines start up, old trucks rumbling to life. The mine people weren't just going to chase us on foot. They'd had vehicles hidden somewhere, probably how they caught other families who tried to run. And above the sound of the engines, we could hear Dad leading them in another mining song, his voice carrying across the desert like he was calling us back home. Back to the mines where, he said, we'd all be family, forever. We ran through the darkness, our feet hitting rocks and desert plants. The truck's headlights swept across the hills behind us, getting closer. Sarah was crying quietly against Mom's shoulder, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. "There it is," Mom gasped, pointing ahead. Through the moonlight, I could see a small building sitting on top of a hill. The ranger station. It looked old, but it had a radio antenna on top. Maybe we could call for help. But just as we started climbing the hill, bright lights suddenly flooded the area. 2 trucks had circled around, cutting us off from the station. Dark figures jumped out, carrying lights and tools. And there was Dad, standing in front of them all. "No more running," he said softly. "Helen, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Mom backed up, holding Sarah tighter. "William, remember who you are. Remember our family vacations, Sarah's 5th birthday, Tommy's baseball games." For a second, something flickered in Dad's eyes, like he was trying to remember. But then more mine people came up behind us, and we were surrounded. That's when we heard it, a siren, far away but getting closer. Mom had done something while we were running, something I hadn't noticed. She'd pressed the RV's panic button on her keychain, the one that makes a loud alarm, and someone had heard it. The mine people heard it too. They started looking nervous, whispering to each other. Some of them hadn't seen real people from outside in years. "Back to the mines," one of the older ones ordered. "Take them with us, quick." They grabbed us. Their hands were cold and strong. Dad just watched, that empty look still in his eyes. But as they started dragging us toward one of the trucks, bright spotlights suddenly lit up the whole area. "This is the Nevada State Police," a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Stay where you are." Everything happened really fast after that. The mine people scattered like cockroaches when you turn on a light. Some ran for their trucks, others disappeared into holes in the ground we hadn't even seen. Mom grabbed both of us and pulled us down behind a rock. Dad stood there for a moment, caught in the spotlights. He looked confused, like someone waking up from a bad dream. His eyes met mine one last time, and for just a second, I saw my real dad in there, scared and sorry. Then he turned and ran with the others, vanishing into the darkness of the mines. The last thing I heard was his voice, fading away as he went underground, starting to sing that mining song again. Police cars and helicopters swarmed the area. Officers ran around with big lights and guns, but they were too late. The mine people were gone, disappeared into their underground maze. Gone with my dad. The police searched the mines for 3 days. They found old newspaper clippings in the tunnels, telling stories about miners who got trapped down there in 1923 during a cave-in. They also found hundreds of cars and RVs hidden in underground garages, vehicles from families who'd been caught over the years. But they never found Dad or any of the mine people. The tunnels went on for miles, they said, with hundreds of different paths and hidden rooms. Some of the older officers said they could still hear singing echoing through the mines, getting fainter the deeper they went. Mom, Sarah, and I stayed in a nearby town while they searched. Every night, Sarah would wake up crying, asking when Dad was coming home. Mom would just hold her and cry too. I tried to be strong, but sometimes at night, I'd hear that mining song in my dreams. A week later, we had to leave. The police said they'd keep looking, but we all knew the truth. Dad was gone, changed into something else, something that lived in the dark and sang old mining songs. We were packing our bags in the motel when the front desk called. They said we had mail, a dirty envelope with no stamp. Inside was a Polaroid photo, taken in the dark. It showed Dad standing with his new family in one of the mine tunnels. They were all smiling at the camera, their eyes shining in the flash. Dad had written something on the back. "Don't worry about me. I'm home now. Someday you'll understand. Someday you'll join us." We moved to Oregon after that. Mom said we needed a fresh start, somewhere far from the desert. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about that ghost town and those mines. I think about Dad down there in the darkness, leading his new family in those old songs. And every time we go on a road trip, Mom makes sure we stick to the main highways. She says there are some shortcuts you should never take, and some families you should never join. Last week, I got another envelope. Inside was a new photo of Dad. He hasn't aged a day since that summer in '83. On the back he wrote, "The mines keep us young, son. We're still waiting for you." I burned the photo, but I can't burn the memory. And sometimes when I'm driving at night and see empty desert roads leading to old ghost towns, I swear I can hear those mining songs calling me home. But I keep driving, and I never look back, because I know what's out there in the dark, singing those songs. And I know that somewhere in those endless tunnels, my dad is still waiting, hoping his family will someday come home, to stay forever. The radio crackled in my Ranger truck as another missing person report came through. Fourth one this month at Pine Creek Campground. As the senior park ranger here in northern Minnesota, I knew something wasn't right. People don't just vanish into thin air, especially not experienced campers. The sun was setting as I drove down the winding dirt road toward the campground. Pine trees towered on both sides, their branches swaying in the cold October wind. Usually, this place would be full of happy families and the smell of campfires. But now, the air felt heavy and wrong. I pulled up to the first abandoned RV. It was one of those fancy ones, the kind that costs more than my house. The door swung back and forth in the wind, making this awful creaking sound that made my skin crawl. My flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness as I stepped inside. The place was a mess. Not just messy like campers in a hurry. This was different. The table was flipped over, dishes were broken all over the floor, and there were deep scratches in the walls. But the thing that really got to me was the journal lying open on the floor. Its pages were torn and stained, but I could still read the last entry. "Something's out there, not a bear, not a wolf. It follows us at night. The kids say they hear it whispering their names. Tomorrow we're getting out of here, curse or no curse." But they never left. Their car was still here, keys in the ignition. As I stood there reading the journal over and over, the wind suddenly died. The woods went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And somehow, deep in my gut, I knew this was just the beginning of something much worse. The next morning, I called in backup from the local police, but they didn't find anything new, just more empty campers with signs of people leaving in a hurry. While they searched, I decided to talk to Bill White Eagle, an elder from the local tribe who lived near the park. If anyone knew these woods, it was him. I found Bill sitting on his porch, carving a piece of wood. The moment I mentioned Pine Creek, his hands stopped moving. His eyes got real serious. You found the journals, didn't you? He asked quietly. The ones talking about the curse? My stomach did a flip. How did you know about those? Bill set down his carving and leaned forward. Every few decades, it happens again. People go missing at Pine Creek. Always starts the same way, with whispers in the night. Then the dreams, then they vanish. What's causing it? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Our people call it the Wendigo, Bill said. A spirit of hunger that never stops being hungry. But this one's different. It learned to hide in new ways, in the things people bring with them. That's when I remembered something strange from yesterday, how all the RV's engines were ice cold, even though it was warm out. And that weird oil smell, like something had been living inside them. The vehicles, I whispered. It's using them somehow? Bill nodded slowly. Metal has no spirit of its own, makes a good hiding place for something that doesn't want to be found. But there's a way to trap it, an old ritual, though everyone who's tried. He stopped talking and looked away. I was about to ask what happened to them when my radio buzzed. Another family had just arrived at Pine Creek, despite all our warning signs. As I stood up to leave, Bill grabbed my arm. Michael, he said, using my first name, if you hear engines running at night, don't go looking. That's not machinery you're hearing. I tried to smile, but my mouth felt dry. I'm not sure I believe in spirits, Bill. He let go of my arm. Doesn't matter if you believe in them, they believe in you. That night, I couldn't sleep. Bill's words kept running through my head. Around 2 a.m., I heard an engine start up somewhere in the campground. At first, I thought it was just the new family leaving. Maybe they'd gotten spooked. But then I heard another engine, and another. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket, then stepped out onto my cabin's porch. The sound was coming from the parking area where all the abandoned RVs were stored. My heart started pounding when I saw what was happening. Every single vehicle, the RVs, the cars, even my own Ranger truck, had their headlights on, but nobody was inside them. The engines weren't just running, they were growling in a way I'd never heard before, like they were alive. I tried calling for backup, but my radio just gave out static. The same thing happened with my cell phone. The engines got louder, and the vehicles started moving on their own, forming a circle around me. Their headlights were different now. Instead of normal white light, they glowed with this sickly green color. This isn't real, I told myself. This can't be real, but I could feel the heat from the engines, smell the exhaust, and underneath it all was this other smell, like rotting meat and old blood. Then I heard it, voices coming through the static of my radio. They were the voices of all the missing people, calling out for help. Some were crying, some were screaming, but they all said the same thing. Don't let it take you like it took us. I ran back to my cabin and locked the door, but I knew that wouldn't help much. Looking through my window, I saw all those vehicles just sitting there, engines rumbling, waiting, like hungry animals circling their prey. I pulled out the journal I'd found and started reading it again, more carefully this time. The last few pages talked about some kind of ritual, the same one Bill had mentioned. There were drawings, too, symbols that looked ancient and powerful. Now I had a choice to make. I could wait for morning and pretend none of this was real, or I could try to stop this thing before it took anyone else. The vehicles outside revved their engines, like they knew what I was thinking, like they were daring me to try. I knew what I had to do. With shaking hands, I grabbed the journal, some chalk from my desk, and a flashlight. The ritual needed to be done at the center of the campground, right where the first disappearance happened. The vehicles parted as I walked through them, like they were curious about what I was going to do. The wind picked up, carrying that awful rotting smell. I started drawing the symbols from the journal on the ground, making them as exact as I could. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, but I kept going. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. It was the family that had just checked in, a mom, dad, and 2 kids. They looked scared and confused. "Get back to your tent," I shouted. "It's not safe out here." But they didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me with empty eyes. When they smiled, their teeth looked wrong, too sharp, too many. They weren't the real family anymore. The Wendigo had them. I started reading the words from the journal, strange words I didn't understand. The wind got stronger. The vehicle's engines roared louder. The fake family started walking toward me, still wearing those awful smiles. The last word of the ritual was the hardest to say. As soon as I said it, everything went quiet. The wind stopped. The engines died. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground cracked open right where I'd drawn the symbols. A bright light shot up into the sky. The fake family screamed, but not with human voices. Their shapes melted away into shadows that got pulled down into the crack. One by one, the vehicles started getting pulled in too. But something felt wrong, really wrong. My whole body felt hot, like I was burning up from the inside. I tried to run, but I couldn't move. That's when I understood what the ritual really did. It didn't just trap the Wendigo, it needed a guardian, someone to keep it trapped forever. All those missing people over the years, they weren't victims. They were guardians who failed. I felt myself changing. My skin grew hard like metal. My eyes started glowing like headlights. The last thing I saw as a human was Bill, watching from the edge of the woods, looking sad but not surprised. Now I guard Pine Creek. I keep the Wendigo trapped. Sometimes, late at night, people driving by say they see strange lights in the campground. They say they hear engines running when there are no cars around. They're right, because that's me now. Part human, part machine, part spirit. When people get too close to where the Wendigo is trapped, I scare them away. It's lonely, but it's better than letting that thing loose again. Just remember, if you're ever driving near Pine Creek and your car starts acting strange, turn around. That's not your engine you're hearing. That's me, trying to keep you safe. "5 years on the road with my mobile radio show, and I thought I'd seen it all. The endless highways, the midnight calls from truckers, the small-town stories that made up the heart of my broadcast. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night near Mount Rushmore. My RV studio wasn't much, but it was home. A few mixing boards, a microphone, and pictures of Sarah taped to the wall. Sarah, my wife who died 2 years ago in a car crash while I was live on air, telling jokes to strangers. Maybe that's why I kept moving, kept broadcasting. Staying still meant thinking about her too much. That summer evening started like any other. I parked my RV on a hill overlooking the Black Hills, the president's stone faces watching me through my windshield. The sun was setting, painting everything in deep orange, and my Night Rider radio hour was about to begin. "Good evening, road warriors and night owls," I said into the mic, my voice carrying across South Dakota's airwaves. "This is Thomas Burke, coming to you live from the shadow of Mount Rushmore. Tonight's forecast calls for clear skies and good company, so keep your dials locked right here." The first hour went smooth as silk. The usual calls came in, farmers heading home late, college kids on road trips, lonely souls looking for a friendly voice in the dark. But then, just as I was about to play some Springsteen, my equipment started acting weird. The dials jumped, needles swinging wild, and through my headphones came a sound I'd never heard before, like static mixed with whispers. That's when the phone rang, and everything changed. When I picked up the phone, the voice on the other end sounded far away, like someone talking through water. "Hello, Tommy," it said. "Remember me? It's Bill Watson from Rapid City High." My hand started shaking. Bill Watson had been my math teacher back in school, but he'd died from a heart attack 15 years ago. "Look, I don't know who this is, but," I started to say. "Tommy, listen carefully," the voice cut in. "In 20 minutes, there's going to be an accident at Miller's gas station in Keystone. Sarah wants you to warn them." The line went dead before I could respond. My throat felt dry as sandpaper. Sarah? My Sarah? I tried to tell myself it was just some sick joke, but something in that voice. It had sounded exactly like old Bill. My fingers hovered over the broadcast controls. Should I warn people? Would anyone even believe me? The clock ticked by. At exactly 10:45 p.m., my phone lit up with breaking news. A truck had lost control at Miller's gas station in Keystone. The driver was rushed to the hospital. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold my coffee cup. That's when the second call came in. This time the voice belonged to Mrs. Chen, who used to run the flower shop near my old house. She'd passed away last winter. "There's going to be trouble at the Pine Ridge Diner," she said in that sweet voice I remembered. 1 hour. "Sarah says you need to keep broadcasting, Tommy. Don't stop, no matter what." I felt cold all over. The equipment was still acting strange, the needles dancing like they had minds of their own. Outside my RV window, Mount Rushmore's faces seemed to be watching me, their stone eyes holding secrets in the darkness. I thought about cutting the broadcast, driving away as fast as I could. But something told me that wouldn't stop what was happening. And if these warnings were real, if I could save someone. "This is Thomas Burke," I said into the mic, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need all listeners near Pine Ridge Diner to be extra careful tonight. Please, just be careful." The night was just beginning, and somehow I knew Sarah was out there, pulling strings I couldn't see. The question was, why? The warning about Pine Ridge Diner turned out to be real too. A kitchen fire broke out, but thanks to my broadcast, they evacuated everyone in time. That's when the police started calling. "Mr. Burke," said Sheriff Mills, his voice rough with suspicion, "how exactly did you know about these incidents before they happened?" I couldn't tell him the truth. Who'd believe me? "Just a feeling," I said. "Call it radio host intuition." But the calls kept coming. Each time, it was someone different. People I'd known who'd passed away. My old neighbor Ted, my college roommate Pete, my third-grade teacher Ms. Robinson. Each one with a warning, each one mentioning Sarah. Between calls, I noticed something weird about my radio signal. On my equipment screen, it showed I was broadcasting from a tower I'd never seen before, Tower 23, way up in the hills. But that couldn't be right. I was running off my RV's transmitter. I tried switching frequencies, but nothing worked. The signal kept jumping back to Tower 23. My listeners started calling in too, saying my voice was coming through on every station, even ones that should have been playing music or news. "Sarah always loved your voice," said my next caller. "My old friend Mike, who died in Afghanistan. She's making sure everyone hears it tonight. But Tommy, you need to find the tower. That's where she's waiting." I pulled out my map with shaking hands. Tower 23 wasn't marked anywhere, but I could see the signal strength getting stronger toward the northern hills. The static in my headphones was getting louder too, and sometimes I thought I could hear Sarah's laugh hidden in the noise. "Folks," I said into the mic, "I need your help. Has anyone out there seen an old radio tower in the northern hills? Maybe somewhere off the main roads?" My phone lit up with text messages, 3 different people describing the same thing. A rusty tower on top of Bear Mountain, where no tower should be. One person said they'd seen strange lights up there last night. I knew I had to go, but every time I thought about taking my hands off the broadcast controls, I remembered what Mrs. Chen had said, "Don't stop, no matter what." The next call was already coming in, and this one made my heart stop, because this time I recognized the voice before they even said a word. It was Sarah's mother. She'd died just a month after Sarah. "Tommy," Sarah's mom's voice crackled through my headphones, "you need to know the truth about Tower 23, about what happened to Sarah." My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I drove toward Bear Mountain, still broadcasting from my RV's equipment. "What do you mean?" "Sarah died in a car crash." "No, honey. She was heading to Tower 23 that night. She'd found out something about it, about how it was built on cursed ground. The local tribes had warned everyone to stay away, but the radio company didn't listen. I had to pull over. My legs felt like jelly. Why was she going there? Because of the voices, Tommy. She'd been hearing them too through her car radio. She was trying to help people, just like you're doing now, but something at that tower, it didn't want her to stop it. Everything started making horrible sense. The night Sarah died, she'd been acting strange, distracted. She'd tried to tell me something before leaving, but I was too busy with my show to really listen. More calls were coming in from my listeners. They'd spotted my RV's lights heading up Bear Mountain and were worried about me. Some said they could see weird glows coming from the top. like green lightning in the clouds. "Tommy," Sarah's mom said softly, "she's trapped there. All of them are. The tower. It feeds on death. Every warning, every life saved. It needs to take someone else instead." Sarah figured it out too late. My radio equipment sparked and hissed. Through the static, I could hear other voices now, hundreds of them, all talking at once. And somewhere in that terrible chorus, I heard Sarah calling my name. The road ahead was dark and winding, but I could see the tower now. It was nothing like normal radio towers. This thing looked ancient, like it was made from rusted metal and black stone. Green light pulsed up and down its length like a heartbeat. "I have to go," I told my listeners, my voice shaking. "But please, everyone, stay tuned. Whatever happens next, people need to know the truth about Tower 23. I grabbed my portable broadcast kit and stepped out into the cold mountain air. The tower hummed above me, and I swear I could feel it watching me. Sarah was up there somewhere, and I was finally going to find out why she'd chosen tonight to reach out. What I didn't know then was that I was walking straight into the tower's trap, and Sarah wasn't the only one waiting for me at the top. The climb up to Tower 23 was the longest walk of my life. My portable radio kit kept broadcasting, the green light from the tower making shadows dance around me. Each step felt heavier than the last. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hundreds of old radios were piled around the tower's base. Some looked like they were from the 1950s. All of them were playing my voice, even though they weren't plugged into anything. "Sarah," I called out. The wind carried my voice away. "I'm here." That's when I saw her. She was standing at the tower's base, looking exactly like she did that last night. Her blue jacket, her curly hair moving in the wind. But something was wrong. The green light shone right through her, like she was made of fog. "Tommy," she said, her voice echoing like it was coming through a radio. "You shouldn't have come." "I had to," I said, stepping closer. "All those warnings, all those people we saved. Each save has a price," she whispered. "The tower needs balance. When we save a life, it needs to take one in return." That's what I discovered too late. I looked at all the radios scattered around us. "How many?" I asked. "How many people has this thing taken?" "Too many," Sarah said. "And now it wants you, Tommy. Your voice, your show. It wants to use you to reach even more people, just like it used me." The tower's humming grew louder. Through my headphones, I could hear the voices of everyone who'd called tonight, all begging me to run. But I couldn't leave Sarah here. Not again. "There has to be a way to stop it," I said, reaching for her hand. My fingers passed right through hers. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "There is. But Tommy, you won't like it." The green light pulsed brighter, and I realized we weren't alone anymore. All around us, transparent figures were appearing, everyone who'd called my show tonight. And they were all pointing up at the tower's control room, where a dark shape was forming. The true horror of Tower 23 was about to show itself. The dark shape in the control room wasn't a person or a ghost. It was like a hole in the world, sucking in the green light. And it was growing bigger. "The tower feeds on choices," Sarah explained quickly. "Every time someone warns about a death, it offers a trade, one life for another. That's how it grows stronger. That's why it wanted broadcasters like us." My headphones crackled with static. Through the noise, I could hear new warnings coming in, dozens of them, all about accidents that hadn't happened yet. "If we destroy the control room," Sarah said, "everyone trapped here goes free. But someone has to take the tower's place. Someone with a voice it already knows." I understood then. Sarah had tried to destroy it alone that night, but the tower had taken her instead. Now it had both of us right where it wanted us. But there was something the tower hadn't counted on. I was still broadcasting. Thousands of people were listening, and they'd heard everything. I pulled out my phone and saw hundreds of messages flooding in. My listeners weren't just listening anymore. They were coming. I could see car lights winding up the mountain road. "Sarah," I said, "what happens if we give the tower too many voices at once?" She smiled, that beautiful smile I'd missed so much. It can only handle one broadcaster at a time. That's why it chose us carefully, kept us alone. I grabbed my radio kit and turned the volume all the way up. The tower shuddered. Sarah's ghost flickered like a bad TV signal. "Everyone listening," I said into my mic, "if you can hear my voice, I need you to do something. Talk, shout, sing, anything. The tower needs to hear all of us at once." The voices started small at first, car radios at the mountain's base, then phones, then people yelling up at the tower. Each voice made the green light pulse faster, made the dark shape in the control room twist like it was in pain. Sarah took my hand, and this time I could feel her. "Together," she said. We walked into the control room, both of us speaking into my mic, our voices joining the thousands below. The dark shape writhed, trying to process too many broadcasts at once. The tower started to shake. The green light turned red, then white, then exploded like a silent firework. I held Sarah close as the control room crumbled around us. I woke up at the base of a normal, rusty old radio tower. My equipment was fried, but my phone was full of messages from listeners asking if I was okay. Of Sarah and the ghosts, there was no sign, but I knew they were free. That was 3 months ago. I'm still doing my radio show, but from a regular studio now. Sometimes late at night, between songs, I think I hear Sarah's voice in the static, not warning about death anymore, but just saying hello. And if you're ever driving through the Black Hills and your radio picks up a station that shouldn't be there, with voices that sound far away, do me a favor. Start talking back. You never know who might need your voice. Looking back at that summer of 1962, I can still feel the thick, heavy air of the Louisiana bayou clinging to my skin. Mom and Dad had been so excited about our first family vacation in our brand new RV. My sister Sarah and I sat in the back, playing cards and watching the landscape change as we drove deeper into swamp country. "It'll be an adventure," Dad had said, his eyes twinkling with excitement as he steered us down the narrow road that seemed to float between the murky waters. Spanish moss hung like gray curtains from the cypress trees, swaying in the warm breeze. The air smelled different here, like wet earth and old leaves. Mom kept checking the map, but the further we went, the more lost we seemed to get. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in orange and purple, when Dad finally pulled over near a clearing. "We'll camp here for the night," he announced, trying to sound cheerful, but I could see worry lines around his eyes. That first night, things felt wrong. The mosquitoes were bad, sure, but it was more than that. The swamp made weird noises, not just the normal croaking of frogs or buzzing of insects. Sometimes it sounded like whispers, like someone was having a conversation just out of earshot. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. Through the RV window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. 2 identical faces, pale as moonlight, watching our RV from between the trees. They disappeared so quickly I thought I must have dreamed it. But the next morning, when we found our RV had sunk several inches into the soft ground, I knew this was just the beginning of our troubles. Mom was acting strange too. At breakfast, she kept staring into the swamp, muttering things about her sister Jenny, which was weird because Aunt Jenny had died when I was a baby. "She's out there," Mom whispered, her coffee getting cold in her trembling hands. "Jenny's trying to tell me something." That afternoon, Sarah and I were playing near the water's edge when we spotted the houseboat. It wasn't far from our camping spot, just around a bend in the bayou. The wooden structure looked old but somehow didn't have any moss growing on it, which seemed strange for the swamp. "Hello there, children," a soft voice called out. 2 women stood on the boat's deck, twins with long silver hair and matching blue dresses. They looked about Mom's age, but something about their eyes made them seem much older. "Would you like some lemonade?" I wanted to say no, but Sarah was already nodding. The twins introduced themselves as Mary and Martha. Their lemonade tasted different, sweet but with a bitter aftertaste that reminded me of the medicines Mom gave us when we were sick. "Your mama must be Betty," Mary said, smiling at us. My stomach did a flip We hadn't told them our mother's name. "You look just like your Aunt Jenny," Martha added, looking straight at me. Such a shame what happened to her in these waters. I grabbed Sarah's hand. We'd never been told how Aunt Jenny died. That evening, when we told Mom and Dad about meeting the twins, Mom went pale. "There aren't any houseboats around here," Dad said, walking to the window. "See? Nothing but swamp." But when I looked out, the houseboat was right there, plain as day. A lantern glowed in its window, and I could see the twins moving around inside. They were doing something strange, dancing or swaying, their shadows stretching tall against the walls. And they were chanting something in a language I didn't understand. Mom started crying when she saw the boat. "Jenny used to talk about them," she whispered, in her diary. "The sisters who never age." She ran to our bedroom and came back with an old, water-stained book. "I found this in Jenny's things after she was gone. I brought it because something told me I needed to." A loud splash made us all jump. Through the window, we could see dark shapes moving in the water around our RV. The whole vehicle shuddered and sank another inch into the mud. That night, none of us could sleep. Mom sat at the small RV table, flipping through Aunt Jenny's diary with shaking hands. Dad kept checking outside with his flashlight, but the beam couldn't cut through the thick fog that had settled around us. "Listen to this," Mom said suddenly, her voice breaking. Jenny wrote, "The twins showed me our family tree today. It goes back to 1862, when our great-great-grandmother made a deal with them. They promised her a beautiful life, but there was a price. Every generation, they take one of us." A cold feeling spread through my chest. The last thing written in Jenny's diary was about going to meet the twins on their houseboat. Around midnight, we heard singing coming from the swamp. Not regular singing. This was low and made my head feel fuzzy. Mom got up like she was in a trance and walked to the door. "Jenny's calling me," she mumbled. "She wants to show me something." Dad grabbed her just as she was reaching for the door handle. "Betty, snap out of it," he shouted, shaking her shoulders gently. Sarah started crying, and I hugged her tight. Through the window, I could see the twins standing in the water, just standing there, not sinking, like they were floating on top of it. They were wearing different dresses now, old-fashioned ones that looked like they were from a history book. The RV creaked and tilted. Water started seeping in under the door. Dad tried to start the engine, but it just made a sick sputtering sound. We were stuck. "They want me," Mom whispered, looking more awake now but scared. "Like they wanted Jenny. It's always been about getting the Mitchell women. The diary says they need our family's blood to stay young forever." We could hear the twins laughing outside. It didn't sound human anymore. Around our RV, the water was bubbling like a pot on the stove, and strange lights danced under the surface. The whole swamp seemed alive, and it was hungry. Dad grabbed Jenny's diary and started reading frantically. "There has to be a way out of this," he muttered, turning pages so fast I thought they might rip. Sarah and I helped Mom sit down. She was shaking all over. Suddenly, Dad's eyes got wide. "Look at this." He pointed to a page near the end of the diary. Jenny wrote that the twins' power comes from their houseboat. It's not just a home, it's what keeps them alive. They need it to stay young. The water was up to our ankles now inside the RV. Outside, the twins were doing their strange dance again, moving closer and closer to our sinking home. Their faces looked different, older, with deep wrinkles appearing and disappearing like ripples on water. "The matches," Mom said suddenly, her voice stronger. "Jenny wrote about trying to burn their boat, but she couldn't do it alone. She looked at all of us. That's why I'm still here. We're all here, together." Dad pulled out his emergency flares from the camping gear. I grabbed the matches from the kitchen drawer. Sarah found an old bottle of lighter fluid in the camping supplies. We had to wade through the dark water to get to the houseboat. The twins saw us coming and their faces twisted into something awful. They rushed toward us, but Mom held up Jenny's diary like a shield. "This ends tonight," she said, and her voice sounded like it had some of Jenny's strength in it. The twins screamed, a sound like wind howling through dead trees. They tried to stop us, but they couldn't leave the water around their boat. Dad shot the flares at the houseboat while I threw the matches. Sarah and I splashed lighter fluid everywhere we could reach. The old wood caught fire fast. The twins started to change as their boat burned. Their skin wrinkled up like paper. Their hair turned white and fell out, and their bodies got so thin they looked like skeletons in dresses. They reached out to us with hands that crumbled like dust. "Our family is done with you," Mom said, watching the boat burn. In the firelight, I swear I saw Aunt Jenny standing behind her, smiling. The swamp water around our RV started to drain away like someone had pulled a plug. By morning, the houseboat was nothing but ashes floating on the water. The twins were gone. We drove home that same day, and Mom threw Jenny's diary into our fireplace as soon as we got back. Sometimes I still dream about those twins and their houseboat, but I'm not scared anymore. They can't hurt our family, not now, not ever again. Like Mom says, some family curses can only be broken when everyone stands together. Something felt different that morning as I drove my RV through Utah's red desert. The towering cliffs around me glowed orange in the sunrise, and the open road stretched endlessly ahead. As a rock climber, I'd traveled these back roads countless times, but today the silence felt heavier, like the desert itself was holding its breath. Just as I rounded a bend near Devil's Canyon, a deep rumble shook the ground. At first, I thought it was an earthquake. But then I saw the rocks tumbling down the cliffside, boulders the size of cars crashing onto the road ahead and behind me. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. My RV was trapped in a natural pocket between two massive rockfalls. After the dust settled, I noticed two other vehicles caught in the same trap, a blue pickup truck and a small camper van. A middle-aged couple emerged from the pickup, introducing themselves as Martha and Jim. From the camper came a young woman named Sarah, who said she was a photographer working on a desert wildlife project. We gathered near my RV to assess the situation. That's when I spotted something strange on the rock face beside us. Hidden in the shadows were rows of ancient drawings carved into the stone. The petroglyphs showed strange, twisted figures that seemed to shift and change the longer I stared at them. A chill ran down my spine despite the desert heat. None of us had cell service in this remote stretch, so we decided to set up a small camp while waiting for another car to pass by. Martha and Jim shared their sandwiches, while Sarah told us stories about the wildlife she'd photographed. But as the sun began to set, something about their stories started to sound off. "I've been tracking desert foxes for 3 months," Sarah said, but when I asked which species, she went quiet for a moment too long before answering. Jim talked about their ranch in Colorado, but the details kept changing. First it was cattle, then sheep, then back to cattle again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The desert wind whistled through the rocks, making strange whispers. I grabbed my flashlight and went to study the petroglyphs more closely. The carvings showed human figures transforming into something else, their bodies stretching and twisting. Below them was a pattern that looked like a puzzle, with symbols I didn't understand. When morning came, Martha was gone. Jim seemed surprisingly calm about it, just saying she'd gone for a walk, but her shoes were still in their truck. Sarah suggested we search for her, but the way she smiled made my skin crawl. I noticed something else troubling. When I looked at our footprints in the sand from yesterday, there were weird marks, like someone had been dragging themselves along the ground at night. And the strangest part? The tracks led right to where Sarah was sleeping. By the second night, I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. I pretended to go to sleep in my RV but stayed awake watching through the window. Around midnight, I saw Jim walking strangely toward the rock wall. His body moved like it was made of rubber, bending in ways that no human should. In the moonlight, his shadow wasn't shaped like a person at all. I spent hours studying the petroglyphs with my flashlight, trying to understand them. They seemed to tell a story about ancient desert spirits that could take over people's bodies. The more I looked at the symbols, the more they started to make sense, like a warning about what happens during each night of a full moon. We were already 2 nights in. When the sun rose, Jim was gone too. Sarah suggested we stay close together, but I made up an excuse about checking the rock slide. Instead, I climbed higher up the cliff to get a better look at all the petroglyphs. That's when I found more drawings that made my heart stop. They showed how to tell if someone was possessed. One of the signs was having no memory of the day before the landslide. I tried to think back to the day before all this started, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember anything about it. Not where I'd stayed, what I'd eaten, or even why I'd chosen this road. My hands started shaking as I realized what this meant. Looking down at the campsite, I saw Sarah waving up at me. Her smile was too wide, and her movements weren't quite right. But now I understood. I probably looked just as wrong to her. The sun was setting on the third day when everything came to a head. Sarah and I sat across from each other at the small campfire, both pretending to be normal. But I could see her eyes changing in the firelight, becoming darker and emptier. She knew I knew, and I knew she knew about me too. The spirits chose us for a reason, she said in a voice that wasn't quite human anymore. We're not the first, and we won't be the last. My own voice felt strange in my throat as I answered, "Where are the others? Martha and Jim?" Sarah's smile stretched too wide. They weren't strong enough to hold the spirits. But you and I were different. I looked back at the petroglyphs. The puzzle pattern at the bottom started to glow faintly in the growing darkness. Something inside me, the thing that wasn't me, recognized those symbols. They weren't just a warning, they were a trap. The ancient people had created this place to catch the spirits, using landslides to trap travelers until the spirits took over. But there was one more part to the story. The symbols showed that when two possessed people faced each other on the final night, only one could survive. As the moon rose, I felt my body starting to change, just like Sarah's was changing. The spirit inside me was getting stronger. We both stood up slowly, our bodies twisting into impossible shapes. The final night had begun, but something was different. Deep inside my changing body, a small part of the real me was still fighting, still trying to solve the puzzle. Because maybe, just maybe, there was another way out that even the spirits didn't know about. In those final moments, while Sarah and I circled each other near the glowing petroglyphs, I understood what I had to do. The real me, the rock climber who'd solved countless climbing puzzles before, noticed something about the glowing symbols. They weren't just glowing randomly, they were lighting up in a pattern. My hands, no longer feeling like my own, reached out and pressed the symbols in sequence. Sun, moon, mountain, spirit. The rock wall rumbled, and a crack appeared between the petroglyphs. Ancient dust poured out, along with a warm orange light that felt like the desert sunrise. Sarah lunged at me, her body now more shadow than human. But as the light touched us, I felt the spirit inside me being pulled toward the crack in the wall. It hurt, like having your own shadow torn away. Sarah screamed, a sound that wasn't human at all, as both spirits were sucked into the light. Then everything went quiet. The crack sealed itself, leaving only normal petroglyphs behind. Sarah collapsed, and when she looked up, her eyes were her own again. Behind us, we heard voices, Martha and Jim, weak but alive, emerging from a small cave we hadn't noticed before. Dawn broke over the desert as a highway patrol car finally found us. The landslide had mysteriously cleared enough for them to reach us. None of us could fully explain what had happened, and maybe that was for the best. But sometimes on quiet nights, I still can't remember what I did the day before that landslide. And when I look in the mirror, I catch myself checking to make sure my shadow looks just right. My camera clicked as I captured another shot of the mountain goats grazing near the edge of Glacier Point. The morning sun lit up their white coats against the rocky cliffs, making them look like little clouds floating above the valley. As a wildlife photographer, I'd seen many beautiful things, but Glacier National Park in summer was something special. That was before everything changed. The first weird thing I noticed was how cold it got that night. Sure, mountain temperatures can drop, but this was July in Montana. It shouldn't have felt like winter. I was in my RV, wrapped in every blanket I owned, watching my breath turn to fog inside the camper. The heater was running full blast, but didn't seem to help at all. Then came the lights. At first, I thought they were just stars, extra bright up here away from city lights. But stars don't dance around like that, and they definitely don't glow blue-green. Through my camera's zoom lens, I could see them moving in patterns, dipping down behind the mountains, and then shooting back up into the sky. I took dozens of photos, my hands shaking from both excitement and cold. I called the park ranger's office, but no one answered. That was strange. Someone was always supposed to be on duty. The radio only gave me static, and my cell phone showed no signal. Being alone had never bothered me before, but something felt wrong, really wrong. Looking back now, I should have packed up and left right then. But I was a photographer with a story to tell. Those lights were unlike anything I'd ever seen, and I needed, to know what they were. That decision would change my life in ways I never could have imagined. Little did I know, as I sat there planning my next day's shoot, that the true horror wasn't in the sky at all. It was right beneath my feet, in the ice caves below Glacier Point, where something impossible was waiting to be found. The morning brought no relief from the cold. My RV windows were covered in thick frost. In July, when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. It was like something had frozen the entire vehicle solid. I pulled on my winter coat, thankfully I always pack one, even in summer, and stepped outside. The ground crunched under my boots, covered in a layer of ice that shouldn't have been there. As I walked around checking the RV, I spotted something odd, a thin trail of mist rising from a crack in the rocks nearby. Following the mist led me to an opening in the mountainside. Warm air rushed out, which made no sense given how cold everything else was. I clicked on my flashlight and took out my camera. The smart thing would have been to wait for help, but I'd never gotten good photos by playing it safe. The cave entrance was smooth, almost like it had been polished. My footsteps echoed as I made my way deeper inside. The walls sparkled with ice crystals, but they weren't normal. They seemed to pulse with a faint bluish glow, just like those lights in the sky. That's when I found the first body. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. It couldn't be real. The man was perfectly preserved in the ice, wearing clothes that looked decades old. His face was frozen in a look of surprise, eyes wide open. I've seen taxidermy animals that looked more alive than he did. My hands shook as I took photos. Then, I heard footsteps behind me. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area." The voice was flat, emotionless. I turned to see two men in black suits, but something was wrong with their faces. Their skin looked too smooth, like plastic, and their eyes didn't blink. "I'm with National Geographic," I said, holding up my press pass. "There's a body here, we need to call the police." They smiled at exactly the same time, with exactly the same movement. "That won't be necessary, Ms. Wells. We're with the government. We'll handle this situation." But I knew they weren't from any government I'd ever heard of. No human being moves the way they did. And as they stepped toward me, I noticed something else. They left no footprints in the frost on the cave floor. I ran. Not toward the exit, they were blocking that way, but deeper into the caves. My flashlight beam bounced off the icy walls as I moved through tunnel after tunnel. The agents followed, their footsteps making no sound at all. When I stopped to catch my breath, I realized I was in a much larger chamber. My light showed more bodies in the ice, dozens of them. Men, women, even children, all perfectly preserved. Some looked like they were from the 1950s, others more recent. Each face wore that same surprised expression. I needed proof. With shaking hands, I started taking pictures. That's when I noticed something even stranger. There were marks on the ice around each body. Not random scratches, but patterns, like some kind of writing I'd never seen before. A quick check of my camera's screen showed the photos were coming out completely black, even with the flash. Whatever was happening here, it didn't want to be documented. In the distance, I heard whispers. Not English, not any language I knew. The sound made my skin crawl. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the cold wall, trying to stay quiet. My fingers found a folder frozen in the ice beside me. I chipped it out as quietly as I could. Inside were old newspaper clippings. Hikers missing in Glacier Point. Tourist disappearances baffle police. Strange lights reported over National Park. The dates went back 50 years. The whispers got closer. In the dim blue glow of the ice, I saw shadows moving. They weren't human shapes anymore. They were too tall, too thin, with arms that reached almost to the ground. Then I saw why they were preserving people. In one of the ice blocks, a body was changing. The ice around it pulsed with that blue light, and the person's features were slowly morphing into something else. Something like those creatures in the shadows. They weren't just preserving bodies, they were transforming them. A cold hand touched my shoulder. Not the regular kind of cold. This cold went straight into my bones. As I turned, I knew I'd see one of those things up close, and I knew that after this, nothing in my life would ever be the same. The creature's hand was like ice on my shoulder, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Its face wasn't a face at all, just smooth, pale skin with dark holes where eyes should be. "You don't need to be afraid." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "We are making them better. We are making them survive." My voice shook as I asked, "What are you doing to these people?" "Your world is warming, changing. Humans cannot survive what is coming. We help." The creature's head tilted at an impossible angle. "We preserve. We adapt. We save." More of them emerged from the shadows. They moved like they were floating, their long fingers trailing in the air. Behind them, I saw something that made my heart stop, a massive chamber filled with pods of ice, each one holding a person in various stages of change. This is their nest, I thought. This is where they make more of themselves. I remembered my lighter, the one I always kept for emergencies. The ice walls around us had veins of something that looked like fuel or gas running through them. If I could just— "You understand now," the creature said. "You will join us, help us save more." "No," I whispered, reaching slowly into my pocket. "I won't." I pulled out the lighter, flicked it on, and threw it at the nearest gas vein in the ice wall. For a second, nothing happened. Then, boom! The explosion knocked me back. Fire spread through the veins in the ice, setting off more explosions. The creatures made a horrible screeching sound that hurt my ears. I ran toward what I hoped was the exit, the heat of the flames behind me fighting against their unnatural cold. But I wasn't fast enough. Something grabbed me, pulled me back. The last thing I remember was feeling that bone-deep cold spreading through my whole body, and a voice saying, "You will understand. In time." Then everything went black. Waking up felt like swimming through frozen molasses. My whole body ached with cold as my eyes slowly opened. I was lying on a hospital bed, but something felt off. The machines looked wrong, sleeker, more advanced than any I'd ever seen. "Ms. Wells," a nurse said softly, "try to stay calm. You've been asleep for a long time." The calendar on the wall showed 1993, 20 years. I'd lost 20 years of my life. "The hikers found you in an ice cave," the doctor explained later. "Perfectly preserved, just like you were frozen yesterday. They thought you were dead until they saw you breathing. But I knew the truth. The creatures had kept me, just like their other victims. Only something had gone wrong with their plan. Maybe my explosion had damaged their nest more than I thought. Maybe they'd just forgotten about me when they moved on. I tried telling the doctors about what happened, but they just nodded politely and wrote things in their charts. Who would believe a story about aliens living in ice caves? Even I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. Then I saw the newspaper. "Mysterious ice formation spreads in Arctic," the headline read. Below it was a photo of strange blue-tinted ice with familiar markings carved into it. They weren't gone. They'd just moved somewhere colder. I checked myself out of the hospital that day. My old camera was with my belongings, somehow still working after all these years. When I looked through the photos, most were black just like before. But one had come out clear, a single shot of those marks in the ice, proof that I wasn't crazy. The world had changed so much in 20 years. My family had mourned me and moved on. My career was long over, but none of that mattered now. I had a new mission. Because if those creatures were still out there, still preserving people, someone had to stop them. Someone had to tell the truth. And this time, I had proof. I took one last look at the mountain where it all began. Glacier Point looked peaceful in the summer sun, but I knew better now. Sometimes the most dangerous things hide in the most beautiful places. And somewhere up north, in the endless Arctic ice, those things are still waiting, still changing people, still thinking they're saving us. But now, at least, someone knows the truth. Someone is watching. Someone remembers. And I'm not done fighting yet. Life changed the day we got that old RV. My wife Ruby and I had only been married 3 months when the letter arrived telling us about my grandfather's death. We weren't expecting to inherit anything. Grandpa Jim hadn't spoken to our family in 15 years. But there we were, standing in his dusty driveway in Cumberland, Tennessee, staring at a 1940s Westcraft trailer that was now ours. "It's actually in great shape," Ruby said, running her hand along the silver metal side. While everything else on Grandpa's property looked worn down and forgotten, that RV gleamed like it had just rolled off the lot. The keys were waiting for us on the front porch, along with some paperwork. As I picked them up, a chill ran through me despite the warm October air. Maybe it was just the thought of Grandpa Jim dying alone out here, or maybe it was something else. Something in the way the sunlight seemed to slide right off the RV's surface. Ruby was already at the door, excited to peek inside. "Frank, come. It's perfect. We could actually live in here while we save up for a house." Her dark hair caught the sunlight as she turned to smile at me. That smile could make me agree to any. But when I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm. Everything was pristine. The wooden cabinets, the checkered curtains, the little dining, too pristine for something that had been sitting empty for months. And there was a smell I couldn't place, like old pennies and winter. "Did you hear that?" Ruby asked, freezing in place. "Hear that scratching sound, like something in the wall?" I shook my head, but then I heard it too, a faint scraping noise that seemed to move around us. "Probably just mice," I said, but I didn't believe. Mice don't make sounds that follow you. We should have walked away right then, should have sold that RV to the first buyer and never looked. But we didn't know about the letters yet, or the blood pact, or what Grandpa Jim had really been doing all those lonely years. And we definitely didn't know the truth about Ruby. Sometimes I think back to that first day and wonder, if I had looked at my new wife just a little closer, would I have noticed that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes? We moved into the RV that same. Ruby said it was to save money, but something about the trailer seemed to draw her in. She spent hours cleaning every corner, even though the place was already spotless. I noticed she kept going back to those walls, pressing her ear against them like she was listening for something. The scratching got worse at night. It would start around 10 o'clock, soft at first, like fingernails tapping on wood. Then it would grow louder, moving from one wall to another. I'd get up to check, flashlight in hand, but could never find anything wrong. No mice, no loose boards. "Maybe we should have someone look at it," I suggested one morning over coffee. Ruby had dark circles under her eyes. Neither of us was sleeping. "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. "It's just an old trailer. Old things make noise, but old things don't whisper." I hadn't told Ruby about that yet. The whispers I heard when I was alone in the RV, they sounded like my grandfather's voice, but speaking words I couldn't quite make. One afternoon I came home early from my job at the auto shop. Ruby was sitting at the little dining table, surrounded by paper. When she saw me, she quickly gathered them up, but not before I caught a glimpse of strange symbols drawn in what looked like red. "What's all that?" I asked. "Just some old letters I found while cleaning." Her hands were shaking as she stuffed them into a drawer. "Frank, have you ever wondered why your grandfather stayed out here all alone?" Before I could answer, that scratching started again, in broad daylight this time. But now it sounded more like writing than scratching, like someone was carving words into the walls around. Ruby's face went pale, but there was something else in her expression too, something that looked almost like recognition. That night, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty. Through the bedroom door, I could hear her talking softly to some, but when I got up to check, she was alone in the kitchen, standing in the dark, her hand pressed against the wall. "Ruby," I was. She turned, and for a second, just a second, her eyes looked different, older, like they had seen things nobody should see. "Go back to bed, Frank," she said. "Everything will make sense soon. We just have to wait until midnight." I couldn't stop thinking about those papers Ruby had hid. While she was out getting groceries the next day, I looked through that drawer. What I found made my hands. The letters were old, yellow with age. Most were written by my grandfather, and each one was stranger than the last. They talked about a group he called the Midnight Circle, people who met in the woods behind the RV. But they weren't just having regular meetings. They were making deals with something dark. "The vessel must be prepared," one letter said. "Each soul we collect brings us closer. The RV isn't just a home, it's a gate." I found a list of names with dates next to them. Travelers who'd gone missing over the years. People who'd stopped at my grandfather's property, asking to park their RVs for the night. People who were never seen. My hands were sweating as I read the last letter. It was different from the others, written in red ink that looked too much like blood. "My dearest daughter will return to complete our work. She will come as another, wearing a new face, but her soul will remember. The midnight hour approaches. The blood pact must be on." The date on that letter was from last month, just before Ruby and I got married. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Ruby was back. I shoved the letters back in the drawer, but one fell to the floor. As I bent to pick it up, I saw a photo that made my heart stop. It showed my grandfather with other people in dark robes. Among them was a young woman who looked exactly like Ruby, but the photo was from 1935, 20 years ago. The RV door opened. "Frank," Ruby called out, "why are all the lights on?" I stayed quiet, my mind racing. The scratching in the walls had started again, but now it sounded like laughter. "I know you found them," Ruby said softly, walking into the kitchen. "The letters. I was wondering when you..." When she switched on the light, her face was different somehow. Older, knowing, like she'd been wearing a mask all these months, and had finally taken it off. "We need to talk," she said. "About my father, your grandfather. About what this RV really is, and about who I really am." Outside, the sun was setting. We had until midnight to either break the blood pact or fulfill. And I was starting to realize I'd been part of the plan all along. Ruby sat across from me at the small dining table, her hands folded neatly like she was about to explain something simple, like what we'd have for dinner. But nothing was simple anymore. "I died in 1935, she said, as calm as talking about the weather. "Your grandfather, my father, made a deal to bring me back. But these things take time. 20 years, to be exact." The scratching in the walls grew louder. Now I understood. They weren't just noises. They were the sounds of trapped souls, the missing travel. "Each person who stayed," Ruby continued, "their souls helped make me stronger, helped me remember who I really am. This RV isn't just a home, Frank. It's a collector, a keeper of souls." "Why me?" My voice shook. "Why did you marry?" A sad smile crossed her face. "We needed someone from the bloodline, someone to complete the circle. When I saw you in town that day, I knew you were the one. Grandfather's grandson. It was perfect." I looked at my watch. 11:30 p.m. 30 minutes until midnight. "The blood pact has to be completed tonight," Ruby said. "Either you join us willingly, helping us collect more souls, or..." She paused, touching the wall where the scratching was loudest. "Or you become our next collect." The lights flickered. Through the RV's windows I saw shadows moving in the woods. Robed figures just like in the old "They're coming," Ruby whispered. "The Midnight Circle. Our family." I stood up, backing away from her. "You're not my wife. You never were." "No," she agreed. "I'm something much older. And now you have a choice to make, Frank. Join us." She pulled an old knife from a drawer. "Or join them." She pointed to the walls where the scratching had turned to scream. The robed figures were getting closer. Midnight was approaching. And somewhere in this RV, hidden in my grandfather's secrets, there had to be a way to end this. The clock showed 11:45 p.m. I had 15 minutes to save myself, and maybe the others trapped in these walls. While Ruby was distracted by the approaching cultists, I ran to the bed. My grandfather had been smart, but he was also careful. He would have left a way out, something to break the curse if things went wrong. I tore through his old belongings until I found it, a small diary hidden under a loose floor. The last page had instructions written in shaky handwriting: to break the pact, destroy the heart of the vessel. Look where the scratching first began. The kitchen wall. That's where we'd first heard the sound. I rushed back, just as Ruby was opening the RV door. The robed figures were at the edge of our yard, their chanting getting louder. Ruby turned to me, but she didn't look human anymore. Her eyes were black, and her smile was too wide. "Time to choose, Frank," she said. I remembered something. The first day we moved in, I'd noticed an odd panel in the kitchen wall. Without thinking, I grabbed a kitchen knife and ran to that spot. Ruby screamed, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was something ancient and angry. "Stop him!" she shrieked. I stabbed the knife into the wall panel. It cracked open, revealing a small, pulsing red object, like a heart made of crystal. The scratching turned to the robed figures started running toward the RV. 11:59 p.m. "Frank, please," Ruby begged, sounding like my wife again. "We could be together forever." But I thought of all those missing people, all those trapped souls. I raised the knife and brought it down hard on the crystal. There was a sound like thunder. The RV's walls cracked open, letting out streams of light, souls breaking free. Ruby screamed, her body turning to the robed figures outside vanished like they'd never been. And then, dawn found me sitting alone in a rusty, old RV. No more scratching, no more whispers, just morning sunlight streaming through dirty windows. On the kitchen table, I found one last note in my grandfather's handwriting. "I'm sorry. Love makes us do terrible things, but love can also make us brave enough to stop." I sold the RV for scrap metal the next day. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear scratching in my walls at home. But it's different now. It sounds like They say in Cumberland, Tennessee, there's a story about an RV that collected souls, about a woman who wasn't really a woman, and a man who had to choose between love and doing what's right. But that's just a story, isn't it?